Thanks very much. It's a real pleasure to be here today amongst so many inspirational young leaders. As a former Test cricket player for Australia, I was used to batting in the top order, so for me, batting last is a different experience, but I'll give it my best shot. My job is to introduce Peter Liautaud. We only just met this morning, and I was immediately struck by Peter's passion and determination to make a real and genuine difference in what he's doing. Parker Liautaud. I've got to get the name right. Sorry, Parker. Parker studies climate science and works on climate change policy. He led a world record-breaking expedition to the South Pole at the age of 19, where he broke the record for the fastest human-powered trek to the South Pole. In 2014, he became a fellow and member of the Directorate at the Yale Climate Energy Institute. He has worked with numerous institutions to assist in conducting research on climate change. In 2013, he was named in Time magazine's 30 Under 30 list of people changing the world and was honoured by the White House for engaging the next generation of conservation leaders. Parker believes we have made some progress recently in the battle against climate change, but the time is now to accelerate that progress. Parker Liautaud.
Thank you so much. It's a privilege to be back here. And thanks again for giving me a few moments of your time. So I mentioned earlier that it seems likely that in Paris next month an agreement on cutting greenhouse gas emissions will be signed. And though it would be welcome after 23 years of disappointment, we know that current commitments leave us 15 billion tons of greenhouse gas emissions short per year by 2030. And for many of you, as we have just heard, the process leading up to the signing of this agreement will have been frustrating and unequitable. Climate change is cruel in its discrimination, particularly against the poorest, the most vulnerable, and many of you may feel betrayed. I have very little credibility coming from France and the United States, but many of you will feel betrayed by an international community that doesn't really appear to have your best interests at heart. And so far, you'd be right, because we've seen with our eyes the pace at which these negotiations go, the flaws in the process. And it becomes clear to anybody involved in this diplomacy that the ratification of an international agreement on climate change is merely symbolic. No nation has been willing to sign a binding agreement that goes against its national interest or forces a compromise. None are willing to make the sacrifices needed to fulfill the need for collective action so far. And when they have agreed, and this is in particular in reference to the richest nations, they haven't followed through. The Green Climate Fund, for example, a mechanism that was supposed to deliver financial support to developing nations to assist in adapting and mitigating climate change. It took 17 years to create the Green Climate Fund. And so far, the United States has not delivered its $3 billion pledge. Japan, Australia, Canada have not delivered a single dollar of their pledges. The fund remains mostly empty. And developing nations have been lied to about the flow of support against a crisis that they did not really contribute to creating, but must now fall victim to. So it is important to remember that promises are only as valuable as the actions taken to follow through. But there is nothing stopping nations from tackling this threat without the United Nations. Nor is there anything that a Paris deal could do that nations around the world cannot begin to do on their own. We cannot rely on a flawed process or the outcomes it has produced to save us from the threat. So if Paris fails, we don't have the luxury of standing on the sidelines and crying out that world leaders have failed us yet again. We don't have that luxury, and we don't have the ability to absolve ourselves from responsibility. But now is not the time for a bleak vision of the future. On the contrary, it's time for extraordinary focus. We have a window of opportunity to invest in building a resilient, robust future economy while minimizing the threat of climate disruption. it's becoming more and more possible to grow a global economy without growing greenhouse gas emissions. Changes in technology, government policy, have led us to decreases in the cost of abating carbon. The price of solar power has fallen by 3/4 since the beginning of the century. The price of energy storage has fallen by more than half in the last 10 years. So if government policy is designed intelligently, a particularly important study showed, this is from the Global Commission on the Economy and Climate, showed that action in 10 key areas of opportunity that are economically beneficial could get us to 96% of the emissions reductions that we need to maintain a 2 degrees Celsius level, though we know that that is unequitable already to many people in parts of the world. For example, today we can implement energy efficiency in buildings, vehicles, industrial processes that could account for 1/4 of the emissions reductions that we need. But we aren't doing that yet. Government policies must incentivize these kinds of initiatives and assist businesses and families against the bias against upfront costs, which can be critical in initiatives actually being implemented. But for every year that we wait for governments to act on our behalf, and for every year that we lament their failure to convene an actionable agenda under the United Nations, the cost of inaction increases. And if we continue to do nothing, we stand to lose over $1 trillion from the global economy by 2030. If we get really unlucky, the total losses from climate disruption could be more than $13 trillion by the end of the century. That's equivalent to 10% of the globally managed financial assets. So this debate is no longer about a clash of interests between major superpowers, China and the US, for example. We're far beyond that now. The stars are aligning to give us one final opportunity to act. But the real work is just beginning now. Thank you.